Welcome to the Foreign Report. I'm Seena Gazanavi. Travis Irvine is in the virtual studio. It's holiday time.
Woo!
And yes, we are still making global news bearable. As we go through the holidays, though, we have a special guest on the show today that I'm so excited to bring you. Nadine Strossen is a celebrated and well-renowned constitutional law scholar. She's the John Marshall Harlan Professor of Law Emerita at New York Law School. She was the president of the ACLU from 1991 to 2008. She's been named one of America's 100 most influential lawyers. She's testified before Congress on multiple occasions. She's been toasted by Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia. It's strange. But most importantly, and I mean most importantly, she was my law professor at New York Law School. I took con law with Professor Strossen, and I got a B of some kind. I can't remember what kind of B, but it was maybe
good.
a B minus, B plus.
That's good for law school. Law school's hard.
Law school is hard, but I did it. And
Right.
It was really amazing. She was so kind to come onto the show. We talked about freedom of speech. She's a freedom of speech advocate. She has been working on it her whole career. She is a wealth of knowledge around it. And Travis and I got a chance to talk with her over our recording platform here. And it was fantastic. Travis, should we go to the interview?
Yeah, let's give everyone a special extra gift for this Christmas season, this holiday season. Strossen really knows how to stuff a stocking full of knowledge.
And so we also will show the full interview if you subscribe to the newsletter on foreignreportshow.com, the foreignreportlpn@gmail.com. Make sure to find us on all the socials. We'll be back after the interview with a little closeout. Nadine, thank you so much for joining us on the Foreign Report.
I am honored to be with you, Seena and Travis.
It's fun. I'm going to do my best to just call you Nadine and not Professor. I am a child of immigrants, and so this is like very strange for me to just call you by your first name, but I know that's your preferred way of doing this.
Well, you graduated long enough ago that you are long overdue to be entitled to be called Esquire.
Oh,
right?
that's true.
Law degree.
Wow.
Yeah. I actually put that on my Delta frequent flyers, Esquire.
We could actually call you doctor, as in Juris Doctor.
There you go. That's fun. So we're going to talk about the First Amendment today, something so critical to everything that we do here in the United States. I wanted to make sure
And I have my First Amendment mug with me.
Oh.
Forgot the exact language.
Oh, that's very cool.
That is great.
I have my last podcast on the left mug.
There we go.
They definitely say whatever the hell they want. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's true. We get the we get to the limits of it for sure. I want to distinguish things first because I think there's a lot of confusion that at least I see out there when we talk about free speech and putting it in the context of government action and control over free speech versus cultural free speech, which is the idea that we should just be free and open and live in an open society where we could share our thoughts and ideas with each other. They get conflated a lot of the time when someone is like in a restaurant and they scream something and they say, I've got the freedom of speech, and then they still get kicked out of that restaurant. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the best way to illustrate that distinction?
Absolutely. The First Amendment, along with most of the Constitution, only applies to government. So the First Amendment literally says, as you can all see here, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And the Supreme Court has long interpreted Congress to mean all government officials in any level or branch of government. But with extremely rare exceptions, it does not apply at all to private sector entities who have therefore no obligation to respect the free speech rights of anyone else. And conversely, especially if you're talking about private sector entities such as social media platforms, they have their own First Amendment freedom of speech to make editorial decisions about what speakers to include, what ideas to include, and which to exclude. So, for example, on your wonderful podcast, I have no First Amendment right to be a guest. You could refuse to invite me, or you could kick me off for any reason or for no reason. Likewise, with respect to a private business, such as an employer or a place of public accommodation, a restaurant or a hotel, they have a certain freedom of association protected under the First Amendment, not to be forced to associate with people whose views they disagree with. Now, I want to be very clear. We have civil rights statutes that were enacted precisely to add to constitutional protections. The Constitution does not prohibit private sector hotels and restaurants and so forth from discriminating on the basis of race, religion, gender. So fortunately, we passed statutes that prohibit private sector entities from engaging in that kind of discrimination. But there certainly is no federal anti-discrimination law that protects against discrimination on the basis of ideas or expression. I should say some states have statutes that protect employees, for example, from being fired because of something they said, but those are extremely rare situations.
And, and I'm glad you brought up social media. The thing I always say about Facebook or Twitter or X or something like that's Elon Musk's personal website. That is Mark Zuckerberg's personal, MySpace page. He could do whatever he wants, say whatever he wants, whatever Elon Musk wants to do with the algorithm to gear it so that his AI says that he's the strongest man in the world. That's his right. There's nothing we could do about that. Is that right?
That is exactly right, with one caveat. And this brings us to the one really narrow exception to the rule that private sector actors are not bound by the First Amendment. If what seems to be an independent editorial or content moderation decision by a social media platform isn't really a result of their own exercise of judgment, but is in fact coerced by the government, including through behind the scenes pressure, then quite sensibly, our legal system treats that as if it were government action. And we know now through the Twitter files and the Facebook files and a recent letter that Mark Zuckerberg wrote to Congress and Google sent another similar letter, that in fact, what were apparently voluntary decisions to deplatform various critics of Biden administration policies were in fact the result of enormous behind the scenes pressure that the Biden administration was putting on these companies to not air certain critics of government COVID policies, to not air certain election conspiracy theories, to not cover the Hunter Biden laptop story and so forth, and to show that these issues are always bipartisan or transpartisan. In the Trump administration, even though Donald Trump entered office with an executive order pledging to end that kind of behind the scenes so-called jawboning pressure that the Biden administration had exerted on social media companies, Donald Trump is being very overt and explicit, as are members of his administration, in putting enormous pressure on private sector media companies. I think the best known example is the pressure on the network to deplatform or to fire essentially Jimmy Kimmel, right? And explicit threats from the chair of the Federal Communications Commission that certain disfavored speakers and ideas better be taken off the air, or else there would be regulatory consequences. That constitutes a violation of the First Amendment. So even if the networks says we would have voluntarily suspended Jimmy Kimmel anyway, you can look at the evidence and say it probably was a result of government pressure, and there should be treated exactly the same as if Donald Trump himself had suspended Jimmy Kimmel.
Right. We've experienced, and we kind of know in society what it feels like when the government says you can't say this or you can't say that. There's been, old comedians that have been arrested and taken off stage back in the day. But this recent one,
and quite recently too, I have to say.
Yeah, exactly. So what was the recent one?
The most recent one that I can think of closest to home, because my husband teaches at Columbia University, just a couple of years ago, a student organization had invited some comedians to perform at a fundraiser, and a comic who was himself gay, and he was also a person of color. I believe he was South Asian. My memory is fading as to the details. And he made a joke about gay men. And the student host walked up to the stage, put her hand over the microphone. This was right at the beginning of his set. And she said, "That will be all." And he said, "But I was supposed to be here for a half hour." And she said something like, that's the end of it. And it was because of disapproval of his humor, the fact that certain people could consider it to be offensive, that he was deplatformed. And there are many similar examples, I'm sad to say. You probably know a documentary was done actually even quite a few years ago, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, about very famous, prominent comedians. Jerry Seinfeld was one, but there were many others, saying that they absolutely will not perform on college campuses because of this kind of repressive incident.
Yeah, I think, but I guess to again distinguish that in and of itself is not a government action. That is still
exactly
the university. That's the cultural free speech that we were talking about, right?
But I think we cannot meaningfully exercise free speech unless we also have a free speech culture as opposed to a cancel culture. So keeping the government from shutting us up is necessary, but not sufficient to have meaningful free speech. When you look at public opinion surveys on campus and off, people are overwhelmingly saying that they are engaging in rampant self-censorship, simply not even addressing at all some of the most important issues in our society, including race and gender and immigration and policing, in most cases not for fear that the government is going to punish them, but rather for fear that they are going to be subject to ostracizing, shaming, shunning, perhaps losing their jobs, perhaps being expelled, but even the social stigmatizing exerts an enormous suppressive effect. So, of course, I would not want government to stop people from engaging in the kind of criticism that we're discussing, but I would urge that all of us who care about the opportunity to express our own views that other people might consider offensive, or to hear what other people say, even if we might think that what they're saying is offensive, that we have to kind of suppress our urge to call for punishment. And we have to respond with debate and discussion or ignoring. We simply have to get beyond this overly punitive so-called cancel culture. And it's coming from all ends of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
Recently with the ascendance of the right, we've got a right-wing cancel culture. For many years, that people thought of it as a left-wing phenomenon coming from universities and powerful elite cultural institutions, which tend to be on the left. But for example, in the wake of the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk, we've had dozens and dozens of incidents of people losing their jobs, including even tenured professors losing their jobs because of people calling up and complaining that you said something disrespectful or not sufficiently respectful about Charlie Kirk.
It's interesting you say that. So I want to say a couple of things. First, to our audience, this is a great conversation. Another time when I want our audience to hold on to the complexity of everything that we're talking about here, because this is like one of those things where we can easily slide into our feelings and then get upset about something or disagree. But hold on to this while we're talking, because we're navigating some things that are really important for us all to hold on to. And I'll speak for Travis and I. When we covered and talked about the Charlie Kirk assassination, we had been nervous early on this year talking about Israel and Palestine and everything happening over there, and we were like, "Oh man, what's going to happen?" And then we started getting more comfortable with how we were talking about it. But I tell you, both of us were extremely nervous talking about Charlie Kirk's assassination or murder. We were unsure what the blowback was going to be, and in fact, even other people at this network were targets as well from people, and it is a really strange time to be talking publicly in general. And then also, just to quickly kind of touch on things that are protected by free speech that I think culturally we don't think about too often. It's hate speech, right? Hate speech is the most vile form of speech in the example, and tell me if where this lands for you. But, the Nazi parade going down the street, totally permissible. They're going to say the worst possible things you could imagine. And frankly, it seems like these days we have some Nazi parades every now and then. That's protected, right? Why is that protected speech? Tell me why.
Yes, it is. And I have to say, I have two relevant books to display precisely because hate speech is or until recently, has been the most reviled, most feared form of speech. And so in trying to argue I took the hardest argument against free speech, and I wrote a book in 2018 called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And please note that the only verb in the title is resist. My goal, along with the goal of those who advocate censoring hate speech, is to resist hatred and discrimination. I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. How could I take any other position? Hopefully I would have without the family history too. First I want to start by saying those of us who oppose censoring hate speech do so not because we have anything but abhorrence for such speech, but because no matter how well intended, censorship is at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive to actually dealing with the problem. We're talking about hateful attitudes. We're talking about hateful actions. You're just camouflaging the problem and probably making it worse by driving the hateful speakers underground where they can't be monitored by police officers and others, where they're driven in these days into the dark corners of the web where they're only talking to each other and not having the opportunity to have their minds changed. Since you mentioned the famous, you didn't call it by name, but you were referring to the famous Skokie case from Skokie, Illinois in the late 1970s. Skokie was a town that had not only a large Jewish population, but given the timing, many of them were themselves Holocaust survivors. And when a group of neo-Nazis wanted to demonstrate there, people were surprised that the organization I headed for many years, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, which for whom Nazi speech was antithetical to our civil liberties, civil rights ideals, and therefore, we defended this fundamental principle of freedom, even for the thought that you hate, to quote Oliver Wendell Holmes, recognizing that it was a principle that was especially essential for advocates of human rights who are often in the minority. In fact, in the Skokie case, the ACLU pointed out to the court, and the case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Courts, where we easily won because this was a tried and true legal principle. It it was controversial in the public, but again, not in the legal system. But we pointed out that just a few years earlier in another town in Illinois, namely Cicero, we had defended exactly the same principles on behalf of the Martin Luther King movement, because Cicero, Illinois, with a totally different population, completely abhorred the civil rights movement. In fact, Time magazine, which was a major magazine at the time, had a cover story about Cicero in which it said Cicero is Selma, Alabama without the Southern accent. I mean, it was completely racially segregated. And they were making all the same arguments that this is dangerous speech, it's subversive speech, it's emotionally traumatizing. And so what these cases illustrate is you have to get beyond the facts and you have to look at the underlying principle that if we want freedom for the speech that we love, we have to defend it even for speech that we loathe. These are very counterintuitive principles, and I can't give a soundbite answer, right?
No, that's why we have a podcast.
Exactly. Thank you. I mean, a little bit of thinking changes a lot of people's minds, but you can't do it very quickly. Because they'll say, oh, you're defending Nazis. They don't understand. No, we're not defending Nazis. We're defending a principle that is important for those who oppose Nazis.
So let's add a layer of complexity to this now. And selfishly, since I had to answer a lot of hypotheticals in your final exam, I'm going to give you a slight hypothetical here as well. But
do you really remember your grade?
Not at all. I think it was definitely in the B range. I don't know if it definitely wasn't a B minus. I feel like that would have stuck with me as a child of Iranian immigrants. It was like a B or a B plus.
But I have to tell your audience that was before grade inflation, and a B plus was a very respectable grade.
I remember I did better in your class than Professor Chang's class because I had him for the other column. That was just a hellscape of a class. Anyways, I want to add a layer of complexity here because we live in this digital age now. And I think the examples you gave here make a lot of sense. But if your thesis is to combat hate speech with more free speech, not censorship, right? Then how do we deal with it in the digital space? Now, instead of a parade, which is a single kind of event, imagine the parade is a single artificial intelligence and its sole purpose is to spread hate, and that it can do so at such a velocity and such a speed and cover every platform. It'll blast hate speech everywhere in every corner of the web as much as possible. How are Travis and I, with just our one show where we're like slowly growing, how are we supposed to combat that with speech when powers that like, let's say this AI has all the money in the world, is backed by a billionaire so that it has unlimited resources to constantly push out free speech. What is the role of society? What's the role of government in trying to combat that?
So this is the very same issue that has been faced by humanity throughout our existence, going back to the earliest form of communication, which was oral communication, that there are people who are more powerful and who are louder and who are exercising that communication tool in dangerous and harmful ways. Every advance in communications technology, even with the transition from speaking to writing, and certainly from writing to the printing press, and certainly from the printing press to electronic communications, every single advance, including the internet, even before social media came around, and now AI, every single one has been greeted with alarm, especially on the part of government officials, about the potential danger of, the ability to more quickly, more cheaply to spread more bad speech. But at the same time, it is easier and cheaper to spread good speech, to spread counter speech. And so this is an eternal challenge that these are mediums of communication. They simply transmit, number one, what we as human beings choose to input and distribute. Number two, what we as human beings choose to consume. We are never, ever going to completely eliminate all potentially dangerous speech. Even the most totalitarian governments throughout history have not been able to do that, despite using every tool at their command, including, Iran and China and others today. And so, to use an economics metaphor, I'm married to an economist, we have to focus much more on the demand side than on the supply side. No strategy of prohibition ever works, right? You're never going to eliminate the supply. You have to encourage people and educate people to not seek out hateful disinformation or extremist material, or if they are exposed to it, to not believe it, to not be influenced by it. Conversely, to exercise their own free speech rights, which also include the right to choose what to see and listen to and what not to see and what not to listen to in educated ways. We need absolutely massive programs on information literacy and digital literacy, more crucially than ever. A number of states recently have responded to these concerns that you eloquently raised by requiring in the public schools, starting at the very earliest ages, education and training. And we also need to develop technological approaches that will facilitate the search for truth and the positive aspects, pro-free speech aspects and potential of AI. And I'm happy to say that an organization that I work very closely with, I'm a senior fellow, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, has worked with something called the Cosmos Institute, which is a group of computer scientists and philosophers that are working to provide grants, seed money, to computer scientists and philosophers who are collaborating in developing AI programs that will maximize the ability to seek out the truth, to exercise free speech, to engage in critical inquiry, civil discourse, and so forth. I urge you and your listeners to look at its website. It's very inspiring.
So what I like about the answer you gave was that it wasn't just everybody speak more and get out there and just go post more. There's a government involvement, but on the demand side of in making the masses more intelligent and more discerning about what they're seeing.
Yes.
So a lot of
education, more information, right? More speech, very much in the spirit of Brandeis.
What I think is different, though, than the historical examples you gave was that I don't think we've ever had the inequality between the people in power and the people that don't have the power, right? The masses. And we have a lobbying system now, and we have a system where the people that are going to be making those decisions to fund those programs are going to have to take a meeting with a social media company that's going to say to them, hey, we'd like to fund your campaign for the next 5 cycles, but this whole funding of digital literacy is going to be difficult. Or in the classic cigarette example, let us be the ones that do the curriculum on digital literacy, and you can go to our platform and learn about digital literacy. So aren't all the incentives working against people like Travis and I and the people that watch this show to eventually get more parity with the people that are in power? Because I think that just the speed and amount of resources and then the people that are supposed to provide us those resources, it just seems like the chips are so stacked against us. I think intellectually I agree with you, but I think in reality and practice, how does that actually ever happen?
Well, let's break down some of the premises in that very important question, which I take very seriously. These are big challenges. The premise that we've got more inequality than ever, I have to reject that. We have more inequality than we should have for sure, and it may have gotten worse in the recent past. But if you take a longer view of human history, we are absolutely, more equal, more opportunity, more education, more access to technology than any period in history. Steven Pinker recently wrote a book about this. There's a tendency on the part of media, and not just new media, but old media, to exaggerate the negatives, right? In the old days, long before the advent of the internet, there was a cliche on the part of print media and the old-fashioned broadcast networks that if it bleeds, it leads. Right? My husband's a pilot, and it drives him as a hobby. It drives him crazy. The exaggerated attention that's given to every time there is even a potential or a near miss of a crash of an airplane, as opposed to the thundering silence about the many more people who are killed, in pedestrian.
I always get frustrated when the pilot lands the plane and everyone claps. I always think that's ridiculous. I was like, what are we doing? This is normal. This is what's supposed to happen.
So, we never have more people been more literate. In the 1950s, a famous journalist made a quip that freedom of the press only belongs to those who are wealthy enough to own a printing press, right? So in that sense, we've always said, and then with when we had three major broadcast networks for the longest time, I grew up in that era, almost nobody else had anything comparable to the access to a mass audience until the advent of cable. It was, 4 networks, so big deal. And then when the internet came on the scene, the Supreme Court, in a landmark case called Reno versus ACLU, I'm very proud, and that was Janet Reno, Bill Clinton's attorney general. So, the fact that that case even took place underscores what I said earlier, that every new medium is greeted by government officials and members of the public with fear about its potential negative consequences. So the internet becomes known to the general public and politicians and the existing media. It had been known to scientists before that. And the first response is, well, let's censor it. And this extremely censorial law just swept through Congress. Almost nobody voted against it in either house of Congress on either side of the aisle. Democratic President Bill Clinton, whose Vice President Al Gore claimed to have invented the internet, they supported this law. The ACLU challenged it, and we won in the Supreme Court 9-0. And by the way, the Supreme Court in champion, and our life, can't tell you how immeasurably different our lives would have been if we had lost that case. We now have whole generations that have grown up taking for granted the enormous freedom of access to information and expression online that still does not exist on the broadcast networks. To this day, I cannot accurately quote one of the most important Supreme Court decisions that comes from the Vietnam era and involved, since we're not on broadcast, I can say it here, involved a student draft protester who was wearing a jacket that said, fuck the draft, at a time when the F word was considered extremely, extremely, extremely offensive. People don't get that today because today it's so common. But it was such a taboo word that the Chief Justice tried to forbid the ACLU lawyer who was arguing the case from quoting it in describing the facts of the case. That's how taboo it was. But anyway, I digress, except to say that I still cannot, last time I did it in a broadcast interview, I knew they were going to bleep me, but the host got very upset. He said, that's illegal on air. And that you're subjecting us to a potential fine. He was very upset. And, it's the very same screen that we're using now. So anyway, that it was wonderful that the internet was liberated from that kind of stifling suppression. And in that case, the Supreme Court said, among other things, thanks to this new medium, every person who has access to it, and it is relatively freely available in both senses of the word free, can have far more power to convey information and receive information and ideas than the most powerful, government official or executive of a communications platform has ever had in the past. And then after that, we had the cell phone technology, which amplified that. So to give the positive side of your excellent question, again, we sort of take it for granted now. But when Barack Obama was first running for president, it was considered to be a big deal that he was making such effective use of social media. And that's how his campaign was able to reach out to unprecedented numbers of young people and students and members of racial minorities and all kinds of other minorities. And since then, we've seen much greater access to office holding and running for office candidates, including the new mayor of New York, who completely depended on the effective use of social media, which is not that expensive. So I think we still have much more progress to make, but I think the technology has much more equalizing potential than the opposite. But we have to do a lot. And I agree with you. We have to find more and more alternatives to the big tech platforms. In the ideal world, all of us would have, many, many choices as to platforms that were consistent with our own views and our own preferences.
I want to get to some more current events ones, but I hear you on this argument. And I think for our audience, I want people to embrace the complexity and that the work that we've done. And maybe, I guess there's a sense from you that you're hopeful about the future and our ability to.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So that's good. Somebody needs to say that, by the way.
I recently read a statement that said, hope is an emotion and is distinguished from optimism, which is an empirical observation. So I am both hopeful and optimistic. And the optimism comes from familiarity with the incredibly creative computer scientists and philosophers and others, and free speech advocates and digital rights advocates. Electronic Frontier Foundation is very important here, who are being very proactive in harnessing the positive potential of these tools. And also the government officials who have been responding through more information, more education, more access to fact checking, and also alerting people to the dangers. I think that's a really, really important responsibility.
And so I can't let you go without talking about Trump. And there's so many things. We could probably do a whole episode on it, but there's a couple. Yeah, please. Do we really need to? Trump has done a few things, and the hilarious. So I want to just
a few. Are you kidding? It is so much that you can't even keep up with it.
Yeah.
So
just in free speech alone.
You mentioned the Kimmel thing, and the levers of capitalism being used to control speech. But what I want to talk about, two more maybe somewhat recent things, is Mark Kelly and some of these other senators came out and they made a video, which I'm guessing is because they knew about the September 2nd strikes that happened in the Caribbean off the coast of Venezuela before the public did. And so they put out a video, and then Trump said that they should be, he retweeted someone that they should be hung. Can the president just say whatever? Where do we say that the president is enacting, like how far does the distance between the speech and the potential for violence or the imminent potential of violence? And obviously there's the January 6th example, of course, as well. But if this is a more recent one, these guys are getting death threats. Of course, like the second that Trump retweets that or re-social posts that, these folks are getting death threats. Where do protections happen in the line? And
See, first of all, the president has the same free speech right as the rest of us to say things that are false and that are hateful and that convey ideas that might be dangerous. He is subject, however, to the same constraints that we discussed earlier. If the speech has a sufficiently tight and direct causal connection to violence or other harm, then and only then may it be censored. So the fact that, it might potentially lead some deranged antisocial person to engage in violence is not enough to justify censoring it. If he intentionally incited imminent violence, it would be subject to punishment. If he targeted, I'm going back to the examples I gave earlier, if he directly targeted a specific person and issued a true threat, that is intending to instill a reasonable fear on their part that they would imminently be subject to violence, then it can be punished. But the fact that some listener somewhere might respond by engaging in violence is not enough to justify punishing the speaker. If we were to say that anything that anybody said or wrote or, et cetera, led somebody, and credibly was the instigating factor on the part of somebody to engage in an illegal act, then we would have absolutely no works, expressive works at all. Now, if there in terms of instigating, there is another example. I want to get back to the Mark Kelly situation because it raises other important issues. But in terms of a government official instigating retributive action for expression, I'm particularly troubled by J.D. Vance's statements after Charlie Kirk's assassination, when he exhorted people to look for statements that were allegedly disrespectful of Kirk or Turning Point USA, and to contact their employers and to pressure their employers to fire them. That is a much more directly instigating role or contributory role in punishing people for free speech. And as I explained earlier, even if the private employer takes the action, the involvement and the incitement by the government official really makes it warrants treatment as government censorship. With respect to Kelly and the others, they were not only exercising free speech rights, but it was with respect to speech that the Supreme Court has always considered to be supremely important.
Yeah.
Speech about matters of public concern, including speech that is critical of and dissenting from government policies. Let's start with the opening words of the Constitution, which I'm sure you fondly remember, Seena. We, the people.
Yeah.
And so to underscore that we wield sovereign power, and we cannot do that. We cannot hold those we elect accountable to us as they are, unless we have the most robust freedom to criticize their actions, certainly to explain their actions, to explain the law. And what Kelly and the others did was quoting chapter and verse from the Department of Defense manual, which literally, talks about violating the law of war by killing shipwrecked sailors, is a textbook example, literally, of something that is illegal under the international law of war and under the American Department of Defense standards.
I want to talk about something a little bit more fun, Antifa. There is this thing that he did where he designated Antifa, which doesn't have there's no listserv, there's no like Facebook group page for Antifa. I don't think. How does he designate that? And we could say here, Travis and I do this all the time. We're against fascism, so we are Antifa.
Yeah.
Does this mean that we just assented to being in a terrorist organization?
No, there's no legal concept of domestic terrorism. It's extremely amorphous and vague. And that memorandum that Trump issued contains even more amorphous and sweeping language. Seena, it said something like any statement that is anti-capitalist. It had just basically was not only anti-fascist, but other broad language that could basically, and this is what it comes down to. If you look at the torrent, the flood of Trump actions against free speech, he is basically using every lever of government power to go after and to try to intimidate and silence every form of dissent, every expression that he dislikes, every expression that is not completely adulatory of him. And you understand from what I said earlier that this violates what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of free speech, that concept of viewpoint neutrality, content neutrality. The last thing the government can do is the most dangerous form of censorship is attacking speech because the government dislikes it. It's even worse when it's, just one person wielding, trying to wield monarchical type powers who engages it. Now, I want to be very clear to both of you, Seena and Travis, that I am independently of any partisan or ideological preferences, doing my best to staunchly defend free speech. The organizations I've worked with most closely, the ACLU and FIRE, are staunchly nonpartisan and defending freedom for every idea, every speaker, all across the political spectrum. And I will say that throughout my now long life, every single government official, including every president, has engaged in serious free speech violations. That said, Trump is in a category unto himself. I already mentioned some Biden, very serious Biden violations, especially with respect to social media. But Trump and all the free speech experts I know, including conservative Republicans, including supporters of many of Trump's policies, concur that he has an absolute indifference to the rule of law, including the Constitution. I don't think he hides it. He says it quite expressly. And therefore, even though, no matter what you think about his policies, if you care about the rule of law and constitutional rights, and if you fear somebody else getting elected and using these same powers toward opposite policy ends, which is a reasonable fear as we look at the constantly shifting tides of political preference in this country, you have to do everything you can to speak out against and to resist Trump's violations. Fortunately, the courts are doing that, including Trump-appointed judges are very consistently and as a matter of principle, ruling against these blatantly unconstitutional measures.
What in the law, though, there's always a recourse if there's an injury. There's always something that the injured party or the other side can do to get relief. There is no recourse for us right now other than waiting this out and dealing with him and voting him out, and then the midterms. That's our only recourse, right? We got nothing else?
Yes, but in a democracy, that's how it works, right? There are some other tools, as you well remember from common law, but even from following public events. Obviously, the president could be impeached. That seems politically unlikely.
Right.
In past times, there were other legal actions that could be brought against the president, but this Supreme Court has really broadened the degree of executive immunity. It's interesting. We're doing this interview today on a day when a very important case is being argued before the Supreme Court that may be yet another result in yet another Supreme Court decision expanding executive power. But the framers envisioned that there would be not just executive branch, that the framers understood the temptation on the part of all human beings and all politicians is to increase power. They were very conscious of that. And that's why they tried to create a system of checks and balances that included not only a judicial branch, but a legislative branch. Where is Congress? We talk about the president's warlike actions, not only with respect to this president, but basically, going back for decades now. Congress has completely rolled over and allowed presidents, both Democratic and Republican, to take away Congress's constitutional power to be the only one to declare war. So, I wish that all of us vote for members of Congress, that if we could make it more of an issue that we want them not just to roll over and play dead. And even if they like Trump's policies, that they take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. We depend on them to do that for our individual liberties.
Nadine Strossen, thank you so much for being on the show. It was such a pleasure. I could talk to you all day, but we've run out of time, and I think I only got through half my outline, so this is a really good sign for a podcast. Thank you. I know I was your favorite student, and we're just going to leave it there. Thank you again.
Seriously, I'm so proud of what you're accomplishing, and it's such an honor to be on your podcast. Thanks to both of you.
And I hope you'll come back, because I'm sure there's going to be more happening, and we'd love to talk to you more. I think this was so enlightening for our audience.
Thank you so much. I'd love to come back.
Great.
Take care.
Awesome. Welcome back to the Forum Report. That was the interview with Professor Nadine Strossen. I had to call her Nadine the whole time, which is weird for me because I would like to call her Professor. I'm a nice Iranian boy, but I said she requested this, so I called her Nadine. Travis, what'd you get from that?
Well, first of all, you were a very good student, to the point that your professor still likes you and will come on this show. I like that she, we're kind of absent some JD News corner news this week, but I'm glad she threw JD under the bus for actually potentially. She pointed out that his logic after Charlie Kirk's murder about getting people fired and everything, that is a warning sign of things to come with JD Vance. So I appreciated her throwing a little shade towards JD. That always, that makes my holidays even brighter.
Absolutely. And I think I tried to challenge her a little bit on how does the infrastructure of free speech get protected? And I think it's a fine line. I mean, her perspective is we need to combat bad speech with good speech. And I think that's easier said than done, but I think we should have her back. And I want to be even more dialed in on having that debate with her, because I think that's an ongoing conversation as we enter this very strange age of artificial intelligence and how it can be just amplified so quickly. I think we're going to see that in the midterms too, coming up here.
Oh yeah, big time. And again, it makes me think of something you've said, and maybe you learned this in law school, about our judicial system in the United States. It's the plumbing is good. It's the plumbers that are the problem. When the plumbers are clogging up the works, clogging up the plumbing, that's when it becomes a challenge for the rest of us just to do our daily duties, literally. So I appreciated everything that she had to say, and I appreciate you for learning everything that she has to say, and always taking it, as we do on the show, with a grain of salt.
It's a me, fascism.
Whoa, Mussolini, when did you get here?
What? How'd you get there? Do you know he's saying Itsumi, which is super in Japanese, and everyone just thought he's saying it's a me Mario, it's a Super Mario. He's saying Super Mario. Anyways, little tip. ForumReportShow.com. We'll send the full interview to our subscribers, and you can check out it on this episode on YouTube. We hope you had a wonderful holiday. We'll see you next time.
Next year.
Next year.